The chapter in adult learning that I found the most interesting and easiest to apply into my career was the Beyond Andragogy, which was chapter 10 in the adult learner. Some things that I found very interesting in it is the different kinds of learning. The core learning principles that were taught in chapter 10 were about the educator must adapt to teaching for increased learning outcomes. So some perspectives when we talk about the psychology of learning is that there is a natural occurrence in learning. It starts as young as youth, and we continue to grow in that learning. It's very spontaneous within our environments. Some skills that we do learn, some examples are how we interact with other people and the environment. What kind of environment are we in? And do we explore our environment? By exploring our environment and practicing lessons over and over, we become easier with those. So that also is a teacher within, as I've seen examples of in my students now, and with even my children as they were growing, that they would learn something and they were the learner, and then turn right around and they would actually teach other people. So by learning things, you actually become an educator naturally. And formal learning is more what we do within our classrooms. It's by lecture. We lecture throughout the course of giving the students the theory, and then by actually giving assignments. Professional learning is when we start being more self-directed. And we find that more and more with adult learning is that you start becoming very self-directed. You know what you need to know, and now we need to figure out how we're going to learn that. And that goes into what our learning styles are. So developing perspectives. So interpretation of new information depends on what your perspective of it. I say to my students over and over is perception is reality. So how do you perceive it? Are you ready to perceive it? Are you ready to look at it on different views and have different experiences with it, the information that's given? Are you developing different views? Are you being able to interact with other students, with other people, and look at different views, having that diversity? And are you able to even interpret those different diversities that are placed in front of you? Are you able to interpret them in the correct way, or is your perception clouding that? And then one of the things when we develop a perspective is what are we going to use it for? And there's different ways, different degrees of how we put meaning to stuff, and then how we would actually use it. So that covers our degrees of meaningful use. The next core learning difference is that of lifespan development perspective. It's the experiences that you have throughout your life. Levison's life task development module is one of the ones that was presented that starts very early in life. And how Levison believed that you become educated by those developing a task one little bit at a time, whether it start with when they're babies and walking on up to adulthood, when you're learning to actually put in perspective and put into play what you've actually learned. Then we have Erikson's stage of identity, and me first being a psychology major, that was something I've related to. Is that what stage are you at learning? Are you at that stage where you want to put that in perspective, or is it just learning to get to the next thing? We have emotions that we have throughout our learning, and that's just part of actually learning there. And the Erikson's stage of learning, I believe that most adult learners are. Erikson said it from 19 to 25 years old, that we have the stages more intimacy and isolation, which either you love what you're learning or you're not, if you want to apply it that way. Whereas most of our adult learners, and even some what we call non-traditional learners now, from 25 to 65 years of age, they're more self-absorbed. They know what their motivation is behind it. and they seem to care. That's at the age when you start to care about what's in your life. And of course, as we get older, it's developing that wisdom of where we are. Let's move on to our next slide. Cognitive differences. In cognitive differences, we talk about cognitive controls, cognitive abilities, and even cognitive styles. Our cognitive abilities is basically our differences are our aptitude, where we are from that point of view. We have to be able to process that information. With cognitive control, are we able to control how we're processing that information? Reason for the information. Why do we need to learn this? Do we have control over it? If we have control over what we're learning, do we find reason with it? And then once again, go back to what is our perception of that information? What is the perception of it to us? With cognitive ability, it's what is your level of intelligence? And intelligence can be graded in many different ways, and we'll get more into that on the next slide. Your primary ability. Primarily, what are you able to do? First and foremost, what is the ability that you have? And then what's the secondary ability to actually be able to apply that information? In cognitive styles, how does one relate to one's environment? The environment around them. Self-consistencies, are they consistent within the learning capabilities? The being able to cognitively understand, and cognitive is understanding what you're learning. And then how can they process that into their reality? That's the important part. All right. We talk about that andragogy is ideally one of the best ways of learning because it is flexible. We learned that by it being flexible that we have to take our classrooms and the instruction has to be given based on the individuals that are within your classroom. What are their abilities? And the individual differences of each student. How can each student actually learn? And it does affect their learning. So their cognitive differences. What is their different levels of thinking? Versus what is their personality differences. I've noticed many times in class that personality differences make a humongous difference of how the class learns altogether. And then that prior knowledge. So prior knowledge can be a good thing, and sometimes it can be a bad thing. So prior knowledge can actually disfigure the learning that happens in there because I've seen examples. I've had a student that was going over banking information. We had an administration, and she'd actually worked in a bank. And so she began to apply all this knowledge that she had from actually working inside of a bank. And it actually hurt her as well as hurt other students that she knew that information because the information that she knew about banking was by working out in the public, and it was a little different than when you fit the rules and regulations of banking. And so unfortunately the student actually failed her skills in that class because she was relying on the prior knowledge that she had rather than the knowledge that she was absorbing and having in class presented to her. So that was definitely a downfall to her. So she, in future classes, she's actually used that experience, which I'm very glad, to progress and not go on completely what she knows from the real world. Sometimes the book sense will teach you the way it's supposed to be versus when you get in the real world and work, things are done a lot differently. So prior knowledge is not always a good thing. All right, so adult learning behavior. So that can play a role very quickly with students. There's things that actually directly impact learning on their behavior. So one is intelligent. Is it fluid or is it crystallized? And there's a difference between those. Fluid intelligence is the ability to be able to solve just novel problems. It's what we have as far as memory, what we've retained. It is said that it peaks in our teen years, but then declines as we age. Whereas crystallized learning, crystallized intelligence, is formed by experience, and it's also formed by the education that you have received. So as we get older, I believe that we do have more crystallized learning. The fluid learning, we just do it a little slower, maybe than someone else will do it, but our experience is we're more confident in that task that we're trying to actually complete. All right, learning styles. There's so many different learning styles. You can go on and on. I mean, there could be a whole book about learning styles, but this breaks it down to that it's cognitive is how you learn cognitively. How are you absorbing that information? How are you being able to think about it and put it in perspective? And how effective is it? Is that learning actually effective? And then we, of course, incorporate our psychomotor skills and our physiological needs that we have within the learning style. So if you can address each one of those, and everybody does learn a little bit differently, but you have to be able to be flexible as an educator and actually even as a learner with your styles and not just limit yourself to just one. One that I found interesting was the locus of control. And so I had some time to look this up and research it and reflect in what this actually means. And this actually is when you have control over your outcomes. And so I feel like that students that feel like they have no control of the outcome, they have a tendency to blame the teacher, blame the material, blame their outside world. There's always a blame game. Whereas if you realize that you have that locus of control, it means that you have control over your outcome. I have many students say, well, I'm going to fail this. This information is just too hard. There's too much of it. So you have to learn to break it down. Break it down to individual. Conquer one thing at a time. Don't look at it like a full encyclopedia book. Look at it from one page at a time. And that's that having control over those outcomes. And then once again, that prior knowledge. People with prior knowledge feel like that they don't have to absorb their stuff. They don't have to get into it and learn the depths of it. Oh, they already know all that. And that sometimes because we have been exposed and we've had experience outside of our classrooms, that sometimes is not the best route of learning. Let's move on to domains of learning. So how do we learn? A couple of different ways, and being in career tech education, adult education, and even working with those non-traditional students, different domains of learning. One, technical. That's when you actually learn those practical skills. I use the example because I'm in healthcare, that when we start initially teaching students about giving injections, and so by giving injections, they've got to learn that practical skill, how to hold on to the needle, how to set the angle, how to position themselves with the patient, being able to actually give the injection, and then conquering that skill, mastering it, so that they will be able to do it in the job field with confidence. The next one is that social domain, learning to have some interpersonal skills with patients. One of the hardest things I've had this year to teach is I've had several students who have a real trouble with empathy. And with patients, empathy is key. Empathy is actually feeling, understanding what someone's feeling, but not actually feeling it. We have to be careful not to have sympathy for our patients. Most patients don't want sympathy, but having empathy, hello, I'm going to give you a shot. It's going to hurt. And not second guessing that or making them feel that that's inferior, that it's going to hurt. Having empathy, yes, what they're going through. I'm fixing to give you a shot, and that shot's going to hurt. And understanding to have empathy with that, and not treating it like it's no big thing. The next one is developmental. And as a developmental, as you get through learning to give the injection, having that empathy for your patient. Also understanding what your strengths and weaknesses are as you begin to grow. So every individual should grow every day within their field. But as you begin to grow, you begin to see what your strengths are, and you begin to understand even what your weaknesses are. All right, so in developmental perceptions of adult developmental theories. So there's several different types of adult developmental theories. One of them is those physical changes in the development. How have you grown as a learner? And of course now even as an educator, I'm able to look at it from both ways.